Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our Revolutionizing Healthcare session. I'm Mihaela van der Schaar, and usually this session was hosted by Nick Maxfield, who was our communications manager. However, Nick has moved on to other endeavors, but I am very glad to announce that the role of host for the Revolutionizing Healthcare is going to be taken over by Andreas Bedorf. And I'm especially very happy to say so because Andreas has a bachelor and master in biology, inclusively evolutionary biology. He is now completing his PhD in biological anthropology in Cambridge. But in addition to being our part-time communications manager, he is also enjoying acting and directing. So we should be in great hands with Andreas. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Mihaela. Yeah, welcome from me as well. I'm very happy to take over from Nick. There's very large boots to fill, I'm sure, but I will try my best to have this running smoothly. I'm very happy about the session today. I think it will be very interesting for everyone involved. So we're starting now, and this will be roughly running until 5:10 if everything goes well. So for today, we talk about synthetic data for healthcare. So it's a really interesting and fascinating topic, and one of the research pillars of the Schaar Lab. Welcome to Revolutionizing Healthcare. I'm sure many of you have already joined the sessions, and welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. If you want to have a look at what we've done so far, for example, the last sessions we had for session number 13 and 14, a nice doubleheader on AI and machine learning for early detection and diagnosis, which have been going down very well. And the last session, we had some very interesting and exciting leading clinical voices who shared their vision of how AI and machine learning is transforming healthcare, and you can find all those videos on YouTube. For today, after this little introduction, we have Mihaela giving us a little introduction to the topic itself. We have a little tutorial on synthetic data to have everyone on the same page about it. Then we have a demonstrator by Jem Rashbass, who will talk us through something that we have created in our lab. A nice little simulator for synthetic data, followed by roundtable discussions with our panelists, who will introduce to you then, and a nice Q&A afterwards for all your questions. If you have any questions that's coming up through the talks and through the roundtable, please put them into the chat at any time, and I will call you in at the Q&A section then, and you can just ask our panelists with your video on. Until then, I would ask you to stay muted. I would also like just to briefly talk about our new research pillar that's just gone online and on the Schaar Lab page about causal deep learning. It's a really nice major new research area. And there you can see where you can find on the page, when you go on the main page of the lab, look at research pillars, and you will find the causal deep learning. I'm sure we will talk about this more in coming sessions as well. Now I would like to welcome Mihaela again to give her presentation, and I will talk to you all later.
So synthetic data, what is it and why do we need it? I'd like to start by saying that while today I'm going to try my best to give you a brief introduction to the topic, we have a very comprehensive tutorial that I have given together with my former student Ahmed Allah at one of our main conferences, ICML 2021 last year. So if you are interested, please take a look at this research. Also, as Andreas mentioned, we have a research pillar dedicated to this topic, our vision, as well as some of the research along the way. So why do we want to do all this? Why do we care about synthetic data? We all know that the availability of healthcare data is paramount. It can catalyze a complete transformation in healthcare using machine learning and statistics. It can improve clinical practice, clinical workflows, empower patients, enhance drug discovery, and enable medical knowledge discovery as well. These are all topics that we have discussed in various Revolutionizing Healthcare sessions so far. But none of this would be possible without data. And what I'm talking about here is high-quality electronic health records data, biobanks, as well as disease registries. However, getting access to such data by clinical researchers or machine learning researchers is difficult. And this is due to, of course, very valid privacy concerns that are central to clinical data sharing. So that being said, access to healthcare data of high quality is not easy. And this is, of course, the result of perfectly valid privacy concerns that I mentioned before. It is regulations such as GDPR and HIPAA that prevent sharing of such data with the machine learning community or even exchange between different clinical researchers. And it is this lack of high quality healthcare data that impedes progress in machine learning for healthcare. And I would argue more generally, clinical research in general. And what history has taught us is that if we want to have progress, significant progress in machine learning, we need high quality data sets. For instance, current progress in translation with Google would not have been possible without data sets such as WordNet, which is a very large scale lexical databases of semantic relationship between words in more than 200 languages. ImageNet represents a similar endeavor in the imaging area and has enabled us to create such a revolution in image analysis and image classification. But the story is more complex for healthcare data. Unlike ImageNet, clinical data is about people and their health. So there are ethical considerations to take into account. And it is not only about privacy. One data set in healthcare is not enough because medicine is complex. There are many diseases, different types of data, diverse populations, and diverse uses. And currently, the entire machine learning research is almost completely taking place on the basis of one powerful data set, the mimic data set. But this data set is just not enough if it is for us to make great progress in machine learning for healthcare. So also I'd like to say that the current solution, which at times give access to only very few researchers that are very well connected to the data owners, whether it's companies or organizations, even organizations that are private or even not private having data, does impede and does impair the really development on high quality data sets. So often you would see, for instance, a publication in the top medical journals where a very valuable data set was analyzed using machine learning with very poor machine learning methods, very outdated, and much better things could have been possible, but this data set was only available to the organization that had the data. So how can synthetic data help? We would like to be able to generate synthetic data to share a synthetic version of the data that resembles the real data, but contains no real samples from any specific individual. In this way, we can take high quality private data and generate synthetic data, which we can then share with the machine learning community. And the analytics developed by the machine learning community can then be imported and given back to the data owners, the data holders. And we have an entire vision of how can this be done and how data can be shared for a variety of purposes, from sharing it to the machine learning researchers for machine learning analytics, to statistical research, to running competitions, to doing better insurance or drug discovery. You can see our vision about a clearing house for healthcare data resources using synthetic data on our website. Now, many of you have not heard about synthetic data, but you have heard about de-identified or anonymized data. Synthetic data is different than these two types of data because the data is created from scratch and cannot be synced back to any individual. if modeled properly. So we have heard a lot about privacy breaches on de-identified or anonymized data. And at times there is a very really big concern with this type of data sets that they have not been de-identified or anonymized correctly. In the synthetic data case, we can go one step further. And what we can do is create these synthetic data sets by developing generative, high-quality machine learning and statistical models that are able to generate synthetic data that doesn't have these privacy concerns. And again, more about this in our ICML 2021 tutorial. But what I'd like to say is that synthetic data can do more than just anonymized or de-identified data. It can not only facilitate reproducibility and developing analytics by sharing data that's private with researchers. It can also enable us, as we are going to see a little bit later, to increase the fairness of data, to augment small sample data sets, increase robustness and adaptability of machine learning models such that we can transfer them across various locations, across different hospitals, clinics, or even countries, and even simulate forward-looking data, which will enable us to tell us what would have happened to this patient in the future, even though that information is not in the current data set. So the desiderata for the synthetic data is to create generative models and metrics, as well as privacy requirements associated with this, such that the synthetic data that's generated fulfills the desired privacy considerations. So what we would like to do is create generative models, and these are unsupervised learning tasks in machine learning that involve automatically discovering and learning the regularities or patterns in the input data in such a way that the generative model can be used to generate or output new samples that plausibly could have been drawn from the original data set. We have heard about generative models that are painting in the style of Van Gogh or creating music in the style of Beethoven. Here is the same thing. We are going to generate synthetic data that creates the unique characteristics of the original healthcare data set. I'd like to contrast here generative models as opposed to discriminative models. For instance, if it is to take machine learning on statistics, the focus here is on density estimation, while in discriminative models, for instance, in statistics, we focus on regression models. So the generative modeling problem for synthetic data is we have a real data set with real patients, and a generative model is effectively an estimate p hat of the real distribution p. And a synthetic data is a sample from this generative model. And we want the generative model to be able to handle high-dimensional data, to be easy to train such that we can easily generate synthetic data and easy to sample from. But the challenge of generating synthetic data in the clinical setting is that we deal with complex and diverse data structures. So, for instance, electronic health records contain not only static data, tabular data, but also longitudinal data, imaging data, genetic data, and even text nodes. And also have a lot of domain knowledge that needs to be encapsulated into it. So building deep generative models to enable synthetic data in clinical setting is complicated. Here you see diverse classes of generative models that have been developed over the years. I'm not going to go into the details of them, but there are numerous, and the machine learning community keeps inventing more. But what is important in synthetic data for healthcare is to take these unique characteristics of the clinical data. We have created a recipe for generating synthetic healthcare data, and this contains 3 key steps. First is to decide what type of the generative model approach you would like to choose. And in the previous slide, you saw several classes. Then we want to construct, in step 2, construct an appropriate representation for the type of healthcare data. For instance, time series, tabular data, images, or diverse biomarkers. And finally, we may want to incorporate a certain privacy notion. So let's take, for instance, an example, and I'm going to show how we can generate a GAN-based synthetic data in healthcare using GANs on the basis of neural networks, where we are going to look at a privacy notion that fulfills GDPR constraints. And this framework is called ADS-GAN and was developed a few years back in our laboratory together with collaborators. And it is based on GANs, which are short for generative adversarial networks. Many of you may be familiar with it, but let me just say that this approach is a very powerful approach for generative modeling using deep learning methods. And GANs are really a clever way of training a generative model by framing the problem as a supervised learning problem with two submodels indicated in this figure. The generator model that we train is generating new samples, and the discriminator model tries to classify the examples as either real or fake. And the two models are trained together in a zero-sum game, adversarially, until the discriminated model is fooled about half the time or sufficiently many times, meaning that the generator model is generating plausible samples, in this case, plausible synthetic data. What we would like to generate is those synthetic data using GANs by fulfilling also privacy considerations. And for that, we would like to fulfill GDPR privacy requirements. The challenge is that GDPR, though, requirements for privacy are not well defined. They are descriptive in words. They are not formal. So we have, for the first time, tried to come up with a way of formalizing this descriptive notion using an identifiability metric. So we have formalized this GDPR privacy requirement as epsilon identifiability, which is a notion that's similar in nature if you are familiar with k-anonymity, but the focus is here to look at the difference between synthetic data and real data. So epsilon identifiability is the probability that the distance to the closest synthetic observation is closer than the distance from the closest real observation in the data set, and that this is less than epsilon. So in other words, we have defined identifiability based on the probability of re-identification given the combination of all the data on any individual patient. With this notion, we create ADS-GAN. But this may not be sufficient for some. They may want an even stronger notion of privacy, such as differential privacy, which goes beyond GDPR requirements. And for that, we have developed yet another framework based on generative adversarial networks that fulfills differential privacy guarantees. And this framework is called PATE-GAN. I'm not going to go into the details of it. I just want to tell you that all these different options are available when generating synthetic data with different characteristics, but also different privacy considerations. At this stage, you may wonder, what about time series generation? This is even more complicated because now we need to preserve the temporal dynamics. Yet this is very important for electronic health records, which may contain data over time. And the challenge here for synthetic data is that it needs to capture the distributions of features within each time point, as well as the complex dynamics of those variables across time points. We have developed different types of models for synthetic data generation over time. And one important thing to note is that depending on the type of data, for instance, electronic health record data that's irregularly sampled versus different types of biomarkers versus data in the ICU versus ECG data, they may require different ways to generate accurately this synthetic data. Another important issue is what happens if the data that we have available is unfair, may contain some type of unfairness. Can synthetic data not only generate data, but take this unfair data and turn it into a fair synthetic data, such that the models that are trained on top of it, the predictive models and the analytics, whether statistical or machine learning, can be fair? And the answer is yes. In some recent work that we call very playfully, I should say, my students call it very playfully CAF, we showed that this is possible. And this has been challenging because there are different notions of fairness, and removing protected attributes such as ethnicity, for instance, does not suffice. And guaranteeing fairness of the downstream model at the data level is challenging while preserving data utility. And DCAF does all that by using a causal perspective to provide this type of debiasing and fairness. So DCAF uses this causal perspective to provide an intuitive guideline to achieve different fairness notions. And the fairness guarantees for a given downstream setting is achieved in this way. And this is effectively done because in DCAF, the local distribution modifications preserve the overall data quality well. And again, we use powerful notions from causality embedded in this synthetic data generation to ensure that high fidelity is preserved while making sure that the data is fair. What about the power of using such synthetic data to train models in one environment, but then test them in another environment? We often may have data locally, but we would like to be able to test the model that we have trained, statistical or machine learning locally, in another data set. And our collaborators may not be able to give us the data from another hospital, clinic, or other country to validate our model. What to do then? The challenge is actually that this is a complicated problem because we need to deal with both distribution mismatch as well as feature mismatch. So the distribution mismatch talks about the fact that the data distribution across the different domains, the original domain on which the model was trained and the target domain may be very different. For instance, the age of the patients or the gender of the patients may be different. But also because of clinical practice, maybe there is feature mismatch as well. So different types of features or information may be collected. So can synthetic data help in this case? And the answer is yes. What we can do in this case, we can use another model developed in our lab called radial GAN, where we can take data from the source domain or multiple source domains and shape it in such a way that it has the distribution of the target domain where we would like to translate the model to. And in this way, using these multiple generative adversarial network architectures, we can reshape the data according to the distributions of this target domain and also with the distributional shifts and feature mismatches associated with this domain. In this way, we can generate synthetic data that has this target domain characteristics and test our model on this synthetic data and potentially retrain it or partially change it and modify it. And only when we are sure of it, we can provide this model for testing at the target site. Finally, is synthetic data good enough? And the problem of evaluating synthetic data is hard. And in fact, we have run a competition 1.5 years ago that we call hide and seek. And we ran this competition together with Microsoft Research Cambridge, but also with a set of clinicians from Amsterdam University Medical Center. And what we have tried to do is try to see whether we can generate high quality synthetic data in the ICU. And I'm not going to go through the entire endeavor, but I'm going to say that this competition has shown us that at least 1.5 years ago, it was very hard to generate high quality synthetic data. And part of the reason it was difficult to not only generate, but also evaluate was the fact that we didn't have very high quality metrics for evaluation. So what we have done since then, we have developed a very powerful way to assess the quality of synthetic data. So you may have heard about a variety of data sets that are now in the public domain in a variety of countries where people have taken clinical data sets, at times famous clinical data sets, and generated a synthetic version of it. Our hunch is that a lot of these data sets are poorly generated. And the reason they are poorly generated is that there are no good ways, there were not in the past good ways to evaluate the quality of this data. So what we have done, we have proposed after this competition a very powerful way to assess the fidelity, diversity, and generalization power of the synthetic data. And we have showed the need for developing metrics for synthetic data evaluation that are probabilistic, interpretable, and multidimensional. Finally, again, if you are interested to read more about this topic, inclusively the evaluation, but also the various things that I mentioned in this presentation, I invite you to take a look at our research pillar. Thank you very much.
For our next step, we have a wonderful demonstration by Dr. Jem Rashbass, MD. It will be roughly 10 minutes and shows a simulator for synthetic data generation and evaluation, which has been developed in the Schaar Lab by Evgeny Savyelev and designed by Jem Rashbass, Mihaela Schaar, Evgeny, and Saushi Tian.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. What I was going to do is give you a brief introduction to a simulation model to demonstrate how we can both generate and evaluate synthetic data. What I'd like to start with is a brief introduction to that model. So I think the place to start is to remember that, ironically, clinical practice has been full of synthetic data for generations, in that when we consider individual patients and our understanding of the diagnosis, treatment, management, pathology of that patient, we have in our heads a synthetic version of that patient, built from case reports, from professional experience, from our teaching as medical students, and a lifetime of experience. So, you know, if I say I have a 43-year-old plumber with shortness of breath, we are already beginning to think about a patient who might have had asbestos exposure. So we often take a series of variables and concepts around an individual patient and bring them together in a stylized way to create a synthetic patient. Synthetic data takes that one step further, and synthetic data generation takes it one step further, in that we can now look at how we can generate real detailed synthetic data sets. And the problem is that we need data. You can't do very much without having data to explain how patients respond, how they're treated, the complexity of healthcare. And yet getting access to healthcare data is often very hard, not least because of privacy concerns, that individual patient data, even when the identifiers have been removed, the direct identifiers of the patient's name, address, postcode, date of birth, NHS number, the data itself is so rich and so fine-grained that it is potentially disclosive, either directly so you can say, well, I know who that patient is because of all of these other parameters, or by so-called jigsaw attacks of linking with other things. And this creates us a real problem for releasing identifiable clinical data. But there's actually much more that we can do with synthetic data than just protect privacy, because we can use synthetic data to help us improve the data sets that we've got available. So, for example, we can correct for differences in data sets from various sources, sort of feature mismatch. Take an example where we're doing a multi-center trial, or we're collecting data sets for an audit from different hospital environments. And at those different environments or trial sites, the measurement of particular features in the data set is different. The parameter ranges are different, and it makes it very difficult to combine data sets from multiple sources without correcting for those variables, or in a trial environment, producing such an overhead of collecting data or collecting data in a very formalized way to make sure that those feature mismatches disappear. The other bigger challenge is also population mismatch, where the population from whom we are drawing the patients in an individual data set is different from one in another data set, and again, we wish to correct for those two. A good example, for example, is the cross comparison of COVID outcomes across the world. We wanted to be able to look at the impact of COVID on different populations and to see how the virus was having a different effect in different populations, and yet we need to be able to control for deprivation, for ethnicity differences, for a whole range of background population differences that are in those two data sets. And again, synthetic data generation and synthetic tweaking of real data sets allows us to overcome that. Another important component is that when we're using data sets for training, we often are challenged by the fact that the data sets have underrepresented groups on the basis of ethnicity, or other features, sex even, that we wish to rebalance. And again, by using synthetic data, we have the opportunity to rebalance data sets to produce better and more representative and fairer training data sets. The other component is true fairness, where we want to remove a parameter from a data set, which we do not believe has any effect on the variables that we're really interested in, but can't be removed just as a simple sort of extracting that data. And so we can use, again, a synthetic data approach to that, to removing those data items from an individual data set. So if that's on the synthetic data generation side, what we then need to be able to do is evaluate synthetic data. And this is hard. And if you want to understand the finer details of how you evaluate synthetic data, there is a superb inspiration exchange meeting, and Mihaela has already referred to the Inspiration Exchange website on her lab website. And there's a specific session for over a year ago on the evaluation of synthetic data that is well worth looking at. What I'm going to stick to is a much more simplistic view of evaluation of synthetic data with, first of all, how do you compare a real and synthetic data at a table level? You've got two tables, they're different. The synthetic one is different from the real. How do I get a handle on those differences between the two data sets? And one of the methods we use is this so-called Wasserstein distance, the amount of work or effort, if you like, of moving one data set distribution into the other, and how different are the two. And again, we'll see some examples of that. For privacy, we want to know, how are there patients in here who are similar to the ones that were in the original data set? So if we align a patient at a patient level with a patient from the synthetic and real data sets, how identifiable are the two? What is the separation? It's different from k-anonymity scores, which are essentially saying the reverse, which is in this data set, there are no patients that are uniquely identified. In fact, there are always groups of, say, K3, 3 patients who are sufficiently similar, so I cannot be certain who an individual is. This is saying, if I align 2 patients and their data sets against each other, how close to each other are they, and are they far enough apart to be different? And then finally, probably the most important assessments are functional assessments. I create a synthetic data set actually to do something, to predict an outcome or to have a population distribution. If I do the test that I want to do on the real data set and the synthetic data set, how close are those two answers? And I can then look at different methods for generating synthetic data sets to see how those differences compare and contrast. So that takes us through then to the actual demonstrator. And if we look at the demonstrator, it's a really very nice, clean interface that allows us to get a feel for how we generate and test synthetic data. So the first thing I can do is import in my data set. And here is my real data set, and I import it in. It's this comma-separated variables, and I get a set of 100 records in. Now, the first thing I can see is that this is a fairly standard sort of classical data set. It's a mess, but I've got things in here that are clearly identifiable, and it gives me a warning initially that there's personal data has been found. So it does some basic string searches and finds that data, and we take, well, just take it out, will you? And so we remove the synthetic data. But then there are some other categories. For example, there's categorical data of male and female that we don't really want to use in its raw form as a way of generating synthetic data. And then there is the sort of typical sort of non-numeric data that has no value for the process of synthetic data generation. So again, we can remove that data and process it into categorical data sets. And we now have a data set that we can begin to apply our methodologies to. And we have a series of models, and here you can see that we're going to use an ADS-GAN model to generate the synthetic data. And what we're interested in this particular activity is privacy. And we're going to use GDPR as our assessment for privacy. We have other functions that we'll come back to, domain adaptation that I've talked about, and fairness. But for this particular one, we're going to generate a data set with privacy protection. Now, we can select how much privacy protection we actually want. And we can have more faithful, so it's more like the original data set, versus more privacy as a more private data set. Now, clearly there's a trade-off with those two parameters. And as I mentioned before, we've got our two components. One is the similarity of the two data sets, our Wasserstein score, and the other is the identifiability of the individual patients in that. And the first thing I want to do is to see in all the range of parameters, what does that trade-off curve look like? And so I can do that. And this then calculates for us the various points in our trade-off parameters. We can see, okay, if I'm actually, I'd really like to get to something that is a sort of halfway house between the two, I can then decide that I'm going to generate that particular data set. I've also got beneath here a set of graphs that show me the distribution of the various variables in the data set, where they're categorical, whether they're variables that are continuous variables. And here I've got age and weight, but I can have, for example, age and ethnicity. And I can then plot, again, those variables in an appropriate way. So I can choose which variables I wish to visualize. I then go on and actually generate my data set with this trade-off set of parameters. And now I've generated my synthetic data set. And here is the synthetic data set compared to the real data set above. What I now want to be able to do is begin to visualize those differences. If I simply want the data set, I can now extract it from the simulator, and I've got the data set I want. But I can now begin to see the distribution differences between these two data sets. And I can take one or more parameters and look at how those parameters vary in the synthetic data set in blue and the real data set in red. Or I can choose to show all the features that are in the data set as a series of graphs to show me the parameter differences between the two. And this allows me to begin to get a feel for how good that generation and trade-off between privacy and veracity has been. I can also run my evaluation criteria more formally. So I can select a Wasserstein score metric, and I can an identifiability score, and calculate each of those for the parameters that I'm interested in. I can also do the other level of evaluation, which is looking at the functional evaluation tests and synthetic ranking of tests for individual parameters. So if I take, for example, the age of the patient, and I wish to use a logistic regression on it, I can then evaluate those patients against those individual scores. And now I've got formal metrics of those tests, which allow me to compare one methodology with another. So that gives you the overview of how this simulator actually works. But we could do other things, as I said, with generating synthetic data. For example, we can look at domain adaptation to correct for population mismatch and feature mismatch. Now, in order to do that, I need to have my target data set and any other data sets that I wish to use to do those corrections behind the scenes. So I can add in those additional data sets. Here's my target data set of the population I'm aiming for. And I can add in as many other data sets with all sorts of diverse properties, which I'm using to correct for the population feature mismatches in the two data sets. What I can then do is regenerate a data set that corrects for those two population differences. Here again is my synthetic data set regenerated, and a series of scores that allow me now to compare not just the target and synthetic data sets, but also how they then compare with my idealized data sets for the distributions for that particular population. So I've used now my external data sets to correct for population feature mismatch and population mismatch in different data sets. Again, I can evaluate the quality and privacy metrics, and again, use the test metrics for outcome variables to see which ones deliver what I really want. Finally, we can use our simulator to adjust for fairness. Again, the model switches to one that is appropriate for this particular challenge. And there are some information here about what modeling and correcting for fairness is about. But to summarize, imagine we have a data set with lifetime cancer risk, and we have this data set from a variety of sources, some of which include patients treated in the private sector and some who include patients treated in the NHS sector. We don't believe that lifetime cancer risk is directly related to the treatment in private healthcare, but there may be a whole range of other factors that follow from that subgroup of the population. So we wish to remove the effect of private healthcare, the imaginary effect, or on any of the data from the data set, so that we can join two balanced data sets irrespective of the type of healthcare that the individual has received. So this allows us then to take whichever protected variable we're interested in, we can select whichever one we want, and the impact target that we're interested in, and generate a synthetic data set that has removed the influence of private healthcare from those records that have it, and remove the impact that it may have had anywhere else in the data set on lifetime cancer risk metrics. And that then gives us a balanced data set that we can join from a range of sources. We couldn't simply just remove that data field because, of course, there may be a whole range of other effects that that particular data field may have had on other activities. So synthetic data allows us to adjust data sets joined from different sources and compensate so-called fairness modeling. So what we've created here is a simulator that I hope has allowed you to have some insight into the wide range of activities and transformations that you can create from genuine data sets, for privacy protection, for rebalancing data sets against existing populations, and for removing data items that you need. I'll now hand you back to the rest of the team, and we'll continue this afternoon's discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this video already. Now we go straight into the panel discussion. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Carsten Newtoft-Niemann, MD, Associate Professor and Head of the Chronic Lymphocytic Leukemia Laboratory and Clinical Research Program for CSL at Rigshospitalets Department of Hematology in Copenhagen. We have Dr. Jem Rashbass, MD, who you just already heard, with the demonstrator, who's the Chief Executive and Medical Director at Health Data Insight, CIC. And Dr. Thomas Callender, MD, who is a Wellcome Trust Clinical Training Fellow in Respiratory Medicine at UCL. We have some questions as well, which we use for the discussion, and I'll let Mihaela take over from here to go through those.
Okay. So thank you again for joining me, Karsten, Jem, and Tom. And I'd like to start with the first question to all three of you. Where do you see synthetic data being useful in practice, and why should clinicians care about synthetic data? And I'd like to start with you, Karsten.
Thank you, Mihaela. And from my perspective as a clinician also developing medical AI or algorithms to enroll patients for clinical trials, it's really a question about accessibility and competition for modeling the data we have available. I just come out of another meeting with the management of our hospital in terms of how to make data from our hospital available for different research groups, how to make sure that we can actually model them. And I would like to extend that not just to make them available for other researchers, but for the whole modeling community. So that's really where I see the major importance of synthetic data. And we actually just used a synthetic data set for a master in personalized medicine, where we had a course on modeling real world data. And obviously we could not use true medical data, but used a very simple way of synthesizing data. So that's the other thing, to market what we're actually doing, what we need for education purposes.
Thank you. Thank you, Karsten. Tom, maybe I can now turn to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mihaela and Karsten. I think I'll throw a little bit further. I think that so from my perspective as a public health doctor, I'm interested in personalized medicine at scale. And the center of all of that is risk prediction, both to determine who should be screened, what types of tests they should get, and then at the other end, when they've got a diagnosis, who should get what types of treatment. Now, conventionally, what we would do is we would develop our model, then we'd validate it on a different data set, and then we would go and implement it. But I actually don't think that we can achieve personalized medicine with our current approach. And the reason, and I'll give one example. So if I'm doing this in lung cancer, I'm using several 100,000 patients from one country, and then I need several 100,000 patients for another country in order to get enough lung cancers for me to be able to build this model. I then need to implement it. But each little hospital or area is different, and I don't have access to those data. So I know that I will be introducing inequalities, because if I use one model from one place and it's not generalizable, and I can't tell what those inequalities are. But then when I implement it, how do I find out over time how the model is actually doing in the real world? Because getting access to those data are difficult. And it's one thing coming from the UK or even the US, where we have quite large data sets. But imagine now I want to go and use my model in Estonia, where there are just not very many people with lung cancer, but they might have a slightly different distribution. They're probably going to use a model developed in a big UK, US, or other EU cohort, and then they'll apply it there. But we don't have a good way of accessing enough data. And so I see synthetic data as a way of actually allowing us to both develop, but crucially implement artificial intelligence, machine learning for bespoke medicine.
Jem, what about you? Would you like to add anything?
No, I mean, just point back, perhaps a different. To me, the most important thing is that doctors care about data, and that clinical practice is driven by the use of data, the interpretation of data, and if you do anything in clinical practice without the use of data, you're doing it blind. But the problem is that data isn't available, either for all the reasons you outlined in your introduction, but the doctors have a fear of privacy. So the fact that you can reduce the privacy burden
I cannot hear you, Jem. I don't know whether the others can.
I also lost your sound.
Yeah, we appear to have lost your microphone, Jem. You're not muted, but there's something wrong with your audio, unfortunately.
Is that better? Different? Is that
yes.
Okay,
Yes,
I'm
that
sorry
works.
about that. So I'm still very keen that doctors use data, if you've got that bit. And often the barrier to using data is a privacy concern. And as you highlighted in your introduction, the use of synthetic data allows you to reduce the privacy risk. I'm not sure you can remove it all, but you certainly can reduce it. So you can increase the use of data. But I think the other thing that's really beautiful about synthetic data is it allows you to adjust that data set to make it fit for purpose. And that's I mean, as Tom has pointed out, that's a really elegant use of generating data where it would not otherwise be available to you to answer clinical questions. So that's my take on it.
Thank you all very much. Andreas, maybe you can share screen for the second question. So what are the key requirements for generating synthetic data? And maybe I can start on this one with you, Tom.
So I suppose there's two aspects to this from my perspective. One is the algorithms and how it's actually done, and you've shown a very elegant example of that with Jem beforehand. I think crucially though, the algorithm itself is not really enough. I think that this is a very new concept, and beyond having a clinical AI department in every hospital, I think that there needs to be more consideration as to how we can make this simpler for the healthcare system to be able to adopt at scale. And I mean both centralized healthcare systems, but also quite dispersed ones where individual hospitals will have to do a lot of the work.
Karsten, would you like to go next?
And to me, it's actually a question about reproducibility. So for me, working on synthetic data rather than the original data set should give me the same connections or patterns between the different data and outcomes that I want to model, meaning that we should be able to train a model on the synthetic data and still see the performance on the original data. I fully agree that we can actually address bias in the data set or differences between different hospital populations, but we need to prove going forward and prospectively that we can actually train algorithms on synthetic data and get the same explainability and the same performance that we would achieve on the original data.
Thanks, Karsten. Jem?
I mean, not very little. I mean, just to re-amplify what Karsten said, but I think make it more general. It is that I want to know that it has functional equivalence, not just for model training, but for every use of that data. And I think that that's an important lesson for the generation of synthetic data, which is that one size doesn't fit all. If you think you can just take a synthetic data set off the shelf and use it for all purposes, that is not the right way to generate synthetic data. You generate synthetic data with a very specific purpose in mind, and you get a certificate of authenticity, if you like, that says it delivers on that functionality with the right statistical or metrics around it to give you the confidence that it does so.
And I might slightly disagree, if you would allow for that, Mihaela. So for me, to make what I consider truly data-driven medicine, I cannot define what is the goal of the synthetic data set before starting to work with it. I can afterwards test whether it actually performed sufficiently good on the original data. But in that process, if I want to make it truly data-driven, the last algorithm, one of the algorithms we published, we actually made a doctor's choice algorithm defining what we needed to develop which variables we needed. And then we made the fully data-driven algorithm. And I'm very sorry to admit it, but actually lost big time. So the doctor's choice model did not perform nearly as good as the data-driven model. Thus, we need synthetic data sets that actually capture all connectivities and all correlations and patterns within the original data set to make it truly data-driven medicine.
I'm not sure that's achievable. I think, when you get to the point of it is all, then all equals the same. And I think that's the challenge. It is always a trade-off.
Because that's my challenge.
The debate that the two of you are having, Karsten and Jem, is a very powerful one and an important one for us in the machine learning community, because I think there are many interesting questions to answer. Is it really possible? And if we generate data for different types of tasks, will that lead to disclosivity over time of this data? And I think it's good food for thought for us, the machine learning community or debate. So we thank you for the challenge. Andreas, can you please share screen such that I ask the next question? And I'm going to ask the last 3 questions to just one of you. So what notions of privacy should we use? And who should select the notion of privacy to be used? So Karsten, I'm going to start with you.
So coming from Denmark, even though I'm working here in Brazil, I believe in a public health system. And I believe that health data should actually not be owned by the patient, but by the public health system to the good of all of us. And that means that we need to go back to the ancient Greek society to ask for what degree of privacy we should aim for. Because we need to aim for being whatever patient within the health system. And I still would feel sure that the way my data are treated are good enough to protect my privacy, still weighted towards the benefit for the common good. Thus taking the ancient Greek position of actually imagining yourself in whatever position in the society and still creating a fair society. And I know that's a high challenge, but I believe that's what we should aim for.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Karsten. Andreas, can you bring the new question? So the 4th question is, will the use of synthetic data enable more collaboration within the clinical community, as well as collaboration between the clinical and AI/ML communities? And let me ask you this to you, Tom.
So my answer is yes. I think that it would be relatively straightforward to answer yes to that question. I see it in both two fronts. Having worked in local authorities across lots of different NHS, well, working with lots of different NHS trusts, we couldn't really understand the population that we were actually responsible for, because we couldn't share the data between us, even though we were all working on the same task. Something like this would go a long way to helping us solve that. So within clinical community, yes, I can definitely see the advantage. And I can also see the advantage when it comes to collaborating with machine learning and AI communities more generally, because well, on many levels, I think that there needs to be more collaboration.
But is there something, Tom, sorry to interrupt, is there something that synthetic data will allow you to do today that you can't do today?
Yes, in a very simple way. If I can give one example from something I did at work. If I had had access to synthetic data during a measles outbreak several years ago in North London, I would have been able to link several different data sets together that I needed access to in order that we could deliver targeted vaccination to the right community at the right time period. I just didn't have access to those data, despite the fact that I was technically working for the organization that was supposed to be able to prevent the outbreak in the first place.
Wow, very powerful. Thank you. Andreas, the last question. So what are the next steps for synthetic data to be used to reach its full potential in healthcare? Jem.
There are many of them, but I mean, I think, this is obviously a start, increasing awareness, but, an understanding of, where it can be used, how it can be used, and how it can, an acceptance at the policy level that synthetic data allows you to overcome some of the really big challenges of access to data. And increasingly people seeing the benefit of using data to drive their practice. Stop.
Thank you so very much to all 3 of you for joining me and for driving this development forward. Thank you. So I guess next we have time for a few questions from our various participants. So I saw a question from Doug Bell. Hi, Doug. I don't know whether you are still online and you would like to ask the question.
Sure, I guess I just wondered, you know, how does it really work under the covers? I mean, can you? I'm sure there's a lot of statistical legerdemain, but you know, as soon as you you know, change different variables, you're changing at least the interaction terms. And I noticed from Jem's presentation that it doesn't even reproduce the univariate distributions of the variables, right? So it is off a little bit. So I just wondered, can you summarize how do you retain the integrity?
So Doug, thank you so much for this question, which is a very good question. So in the demonstrator, we were showing all the different variables one by one and with their distributions and how the synthetic data actually was capturing that. But you are right, these generative models are built in such a way, and there are different classes of generative models that are each working slightly differently. But the goal is to really model correctly these joint distributions, both in the static data as well as dynamic data. So the focus is, again, maybe very playfully described through this generative adversarial network, create as realistic patients as possible through the synthetic data generation, such that the discriminator is not able to identify that this could be an unrealistic patient. So in other words, the joint distributions needs to be sufficiently well characterized. So the interrelationships between variables need to be sufficiently well characterized and captured by these generative models such that one cannot distinguish real from synthetic. And again, this is a very, very, very brief presentation, but a very detailed presentation of these models and how different models cope with this issue, inclusively in the static data as well as time series data, can be found in the tutorial I gave last summer with Ahmed Allah. And I guess you were in the PhD committee of the students. So
yes. I
that
remember.
a lot of the information is there or on our website.
Okay.
Thank you. Matthew, I think you had a question as well that relates, I think, with the question of Doug. Would you like to ask it?
Yes, thanks for inviting me. And yeah, it very much does relate exactly to that. Excuse me for my voice. So my understanding is that these generative models, whether it's a GAN or something else, are trying to match or estimate the joint probability to do some kind of conditional probability estimation. And that's great. And you can match the surface level statistical properties. I wonder how far you think that can get us without some notion of causality within the generative model.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for this excellent question. So let me start by saying that, of course, in many scenarios, we may not have causal relationships. We may have associations, but not causal relationships. However, if either we have causal relationship based on clinical knowledge, or we try, and this is where it's relevant at the beginning of this Revolutionizing Healthcare, there was an announcement of a new research pillar in our lab that we call deep causal learning, or deep causal learning, or causal deep learning, depending on how you want to put the two adjectives together. And the focus there is that these causal relationships may not be truly there, but we may have a certain probability distribution associated with these causal structures that we can learn from data. Then we can inject in these generative models, these causal relationships, this type of structure, whether it's coming from human clinical knowledge, expert knowledge, or whether unraveled from data, and they can assist the generation of synthetic data, and that will much improve not only the performance of synthetic data and its accuracy, but also, as I showed in the decaf model where we have used the causal structure, it can even help with issues such as fairness. So very much so, the power of causality can be very useful here if one can unravel it or at least determine it on the basis of the available data. And if you want to learn more about how to build these causal deep learning models, we have a parallel session to this one that's a little bit more geeky, is focused on machine learning models we call inspiration exchange. And I'd like to invite any one of you interested in causal deep learning to join us there. Elisa, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks, Mihaela. Hello, everyone. So first of all, very interesting topic. I'm a clinician. I'm very passionate in machine learning using for my project. And as far as I can understand, synthetic data can be used not only for overcome privacy issues, which are quite important in healthcare, but also to overcome some possible issues related to the real data set. So what I would like to ask is, in the simulation, I've noticed that there is the option of domain adaptation. Can the domain adaptation be used to overcome some possible issues related to unbalanced real data set? And for unbalanced, for instance, I'm referring to some diseases that which distribution is very different across population, for instance, gender, age, or particular ethnicity. And most of the time, using machine learning or analyzing this kind of data is very difficult. So can domain adaptation be used to overcome that? And the second question is that for a clinician, is also important to make sure that we retain all the information that we need for clinical purposes. How can I assess if these synthetic data actually retain the information that I have and that I want for clinical purposes? Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa, for two great questions. So the first question, I guess my presentation was not clear enough, and I'd apologize for that. So as a matter of fact, what I was trying to show through this method that we call radial GAN is exactly this type of domain adaptation that you are talking about, and that was also highlighted in the demonstrator that Jem has shown. So we have a scenario where we have populations that come from very different, again, locations, countries, or ecosystems, or maybe even just different hospitals that may have the type of distribution mismatch and feature mismatch that you are alluding to. And these are exactly this type of generative models that not only try to generate synthetic data with the original characteristics of the original data, but rather try to shift it to have unique characteristics in this target or new domain. So the radial GAN framework is exactly trying to do that, trying to generate data that has the unique characteristics and distribution and features of this new type of domain. So radial GAN is the keyword as an example of a particular methodology, one of the many methodologies that can do that. So the answer is yes, it is possible. The second methodology, actually, the second question is also very relevant, which relates to really how can we assess the quality of the synthetic data, and has been alluded by both Karsten as well as Jem, inclusively in their discussion. I think how to assess synthetic data is challenging. Some people would argue that defining a very specific task, whether it's prediction or determining features or variables of importance, and testing them on the synthetic data set and then showing that the same features are relevant in the real data set is let's say, a test of the quality of this synthetic data. On the other hand, another way of thinking is to say, well, I would like to understand how much this synthetic data is capable to cover the existing data that I have, how well it's representative of the original data, how precise it is, or other metrics of fidelity could be computed and estimated. And that's the way to really give confidence to a clinician that the synthetic data is indeed representative of the original data. But I think that that is an important frontier, I would say, for machine learning. How shall we really assess the quality of synthetic data? And it is my big worry after running this competition 1.5 years ago that assessment of synthetic data is a very important yet understudied field. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I guess in view of time, we probably will need to conclude. So Andreas, maybe we go back to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, everyone, for this very interesting discussion, and everyone who puts questions forward to the panel as well. I thank you very much for joining us for this session. If you haven't already, please take a look at our new research pillar, causal deep learning, and also everything we have on our website about synthetic data and healthcare. What is next to come? The next Revolutionizing Healthcare session will be on the 25th of May and will be about how machine learning can transform clinical trials. So watch out for that. We will send out more information via email as usual for that. And today's session will be available on YouTube from next week. Also, just as usual, and just as I said, there will be a slightly longer version of Jem's demonstrator and some more information from his side about synthetic data. As always, if you have any practicing clinician friends and colleagues that you think could benefit from this session, please let them know and sign up on our website and the engagement sessions and Revolutionizing Healthcare. Other than that, thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you to Mihaela and all of you who came today. I hope you had a very nice Easter and a nice way back into work. And I'm looking forward to see you next time.